On a routine flight, millionaire Big Shaq notices a shivering homeless man struggling to stay warm. A simple act of kindness, offering his coat, turns his world upside down when he discovers the man is his estranged brother, lost to the streets and seeking redemption. As buried secrets resurface, Shaq must decide. Will he face his past or walk away again? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hum of jet engines filled the air as passengers shuffled down the sleek, carpeted aisles of the private luxury aircraft. The scent of polished leather and expensive cologne clung to the atmosphere, mingling with the distant chatter of the privileged few who could afford first-class travel. Big Shaq, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders, strode down the aisle with the effortless confidence of a man who had conquered the world. His presence turned heads, some with admiration, others with calculated envy. He barely acknowledged the flight attendants as they greeted him with rehearsed politeness. He was used to this, being the man who commanded attention without asking for it. He loosened his silk tie, his sharp, dark eyes scanning for his seat near the window. This flight was just another routine trip, another business deal waiting at the other end, nothing unusual. And then he saw him. In the cramped, dimly lit economy cabin, a figure hunched against the window, a man wrapped in layers of ragged clothing, shivering despite the heavy fabric clinging to his frail frame. His face was partially hidden beneath the shadow of an old beanie, his knuckles raw and red from the cold. He clutched his arms tightly around himself, his body barely able to contain the tremors that racked through him. Shaq's brow furrowed slightly. Homeless? On a flight like this? That was rare. More than rare. It was unheard of. He glanced toward the flight crew, who had gathered near the front of the plane, whispering among themselves while throwing nervous glances at the disheveled passenger. One of the flight attendants, a blonde woman with a stiff posture and an air of practiced courtesy, finally approached the man. "Sir, you need to be properly dressed for this flight. We cannot allow passengers in distress to—" "I'm fine." The man's voice was hoarse, barely audible. He pulled his coat tighter, but it was useless. He was freezing, his lips pale and cracked. His breathing was shallow, labored. Shaq watched, something tightening in his chest. He didn't know why. He had seen plenty of people down on their luck before. Hell, he had once been one of them, before he built his empire from the ground up. But there was something about this man. Something familiar in the way he held himself, in the deep-set lines on his face, in the quiet defeat lingering in his posture. The passengers seated nearby had begun to murmur. A woman in a fur coat wrinkled her nose in distaste. A businessman in a navy suit shifted uncomfortably, casting side glances at the homeless man as if his mere presence was an inconvenience. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Shaq should have ignored it. It wasn't his problem. The man had gotten on the flight somehow, and it wasn't his responsibility to fix it. But still, he found himself unable to look away. The flight attendant pressed on, forcing a tighter smile. "We can offer you a blanket, but if you are experiencing health concerns, we will have to ask you to disembark and seek assistance." The man stiffened, his breath catching. The reaction was small but noticeable. Fear, panic, desperation. He wasn't just cold. He was afraid. Shaq's jaw tensed. The feeling in his gut intensified. Without thinking, he unfastened the thick designer coat draped over his arm and stepped forward, his towering presence immediately drawing attention. The flight attendant faltered mid-sentence, her eyes widening in recognition. Shaq extended the coat toward the man. "Here." The homeless man hesitated, his bloodshot eyes snapping up toward Shaq's face for the first time. Recognition flashed. Brief, unreadable. He stared at the coat, his hands clenching against the fabric of his own tattered sleeves. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Mr. Shaq, you don't have to—" "I said here," Shaq repeated, his voice calm, firm. The man's fingers trembled as he reached for the coat, his movements sluggish, as if each second was a battle against exhaustion. When his fingers brushed against the fabric, Shaq caught a glimpse of the scarred skin on his wrist. Old wounds, long healed, but still whispering of a painful past. For the briefest second, Shaq's chest tightened. The man clutched the coat, pulling it over himself, his face half hidden beneath the folds. He exhaled a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging in what could only be described as relief. The murmurs in the cabin quieted, but the tension still hung thick in the air. The flight attendant, clearly thrown off by the unexpected interaction, nodded stiffly. "Very well. We'll be taking off shortly. Please take your seat." Mr. Shaq didn't respond immediately. He was still looking at the man. That feeling was still there. That unshakable familiarity, like an old memory scratching at the edges of his consciousness. But no, it wasn't possible. Pushing the thought aside, he turned and made his way back to first class. As he settled into his luxurious leather seat, he let out a slow breath, shaking off the strange unease settling in his bones. The engines roared as the plane began its ascent, the world below shrinking into distant city lights. Shaq leaned back, closing his eyes. But in the depths of his mind, something stirred. A memory, blurred and forgotten, trying to resurface. And somewhere behind him, wrapped in the coat he had just given, the homeless man sat staring down at his own trembling hands. His eyes glossed over with something unreadable. A whisper. A thought left unspoken. "He doesn't recognize me. Not yet. But he would. And when he did, it would change everything." The hum of the airplane filled the first-class cabin, blending with the occasional clinking of glasses and murmured conversations. The world outside was nothing but endless darkness, scattered with the occasional flicker of distant city lights. Inside, the controlled luxury of the cabin was a stark contrast to the turmoil stirring inside Big Shaq. He exhaled slowly, adjusting in his seat. Something about that man, the way his fingers trembled, the way his hollow eyes had locked onto him, the way he had whispered his name without actually saying it. It gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. He clenched his jaw and shook the thought away. He didn't have time for distractions. But no matter how much he tried to dismiss it, his mind had already begun pulling him backward, into a place he never liked to visit. Then, a house of broken promises. The house had always been cold, even in the middle of summer. It wasn't just the peeling walls or the draft sneaking in through the cracks in the foundation. It was the silence. The kind of silence that was thick with unspoken threats and shattered hopes. Shaq was 12 years old, curled up on a tattered couch that smelled of old cigarette smoke. The muffled voices of his parents slithered in from the next room. His mother's voice, shaky, pleading. His father's voice, low, slurred, unpredictable. Then came the crash, a glass shattering against the wall. Shaq squeezed his eyes shut. He knew better than to move. A small hand gripped his sleeve. He turned his head to see his younger brother, no more than 8, peering at him with wide, fearful eyes. His brother was trembling, not from the cold, but from the unrelenting fear that had become part of their daily lives. "Shaq," his brother whispered, voice barely audible over the rising argument in the other room. "Are they gonna stop?" Shaq didn't have an answer. He never did. All he could do was pull his brother closer, shielding him from the noise, from the tension, from everything they couldn't escape. He had promised him once, on a night much like this, that they would leave together someday. That one day, they'd have a different life. But promises in that house were like cheap paper. They burned too easily. And one night Shaq left. He never looked back. Now, an unshakable presence. Shaq blinked, his throat dry. The memory clung to him like a stain that refused to wash out. Shifting in his seat, he glanced over his shoulder, just for a second. The homeless man was still watching him. There was nothing obvious, no words exchanged, no sudden movements, but the look in his eyes was enough. It was the kind of stare that wasn't just recognizing a stranger. It was the kind that was remembering someone from another life. Shaq turned away quickly, his heart beating slightly faster than before. This was stupid. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. Then, a brother. Left behind. The night Shaq left had been colder than usual. He had stuffed everything he owned into a small, ripped backpack, which wasn't much, just a couple of shirts, a folded note his mother once gave him, and exactly $18.50. That was all he had to his name. His hands had shaken, not from fear, but from something worse. Guilt. He had promised his brother he would take him too. But that night, as he watched his brother sleep, curled into himself on their shared mattress, something in Shaq broke. He couldn't do it. He had to get out before he became like their father, before the weight of their home crushed him into someone he didn't want to be. So he left. His brother had woken up just as he was stepping out the door. "Shaq?" His voice was thick with sleep, confusion settling in his tired eyes. Shaq hesitated. He wanted to say something, to explain, to make it hurt less, to fix the betrayal before it even began. But he didn't. He turned away and walked into the night, never once looking back. Now, an unfinished conversation. Shaq swallowed hard, his fingers pressing against the armrest of his seat. He needed to stop thinking about this. It had been years. He had moved on. The past was the past. He closed his eyes, willing himself to focus on something else, anything else. But then, a soft shuffle of movement. Shaq opened his eyes, glancing to his left. The homeless man had moved, shifting slightly in his seat in economy class, but his gaze was still there. Not intense, not aggressive, but waiting. For what? Shaq didn't know. But suddenly the plane felt smaller, the air thicker. He took a slow breath, but it didn't help. Somewhere, deep in his gut, an unsettling truth was clawing its way to the surface, and he wasn't sure he wanted to face it. Then, the cost of a choice. The first night Shaq spent on his own, he slept on a bus station bench. By the second night, he realized that hunger wasn't just a discomfort. It was an enemy. By the third, he knew that no one was coming to save him. The years that followed had been a battle. He had fought his way up from nothing, making his way through shelters, odd jobs, hustling where he had to. He had built his life brick by brick, turning himself into something bigger than the broken boy he once was. But success came at a cost. He had burned bridges, left people behind. His brother had been one of them. Now, the inevitable realization. Shaq's fingers curled into fists. His heart was pounding now, a steady, unshakable rhythm against his ribs. He couldn't keep looking over his shoulder, but he could feel the stare. It was inescapable. And then, the moment finally snapped. The homeless man moved slightly forward, just enough for the cabin's dim light to catch his face at the right angle. Shaq saw it. The shape of his jaw, the slight scar just above his brow, a scar he remembered giving him when they were just kids, wrestling in their shared bedroom. It was him, his brother, alive, and watching him. A rush of cold dread crawled up Shaq's spine. His breath caught in his throat. Everything he had buried, everything he had left behind, it was here, sitting just a few feet away, staring right at him, waiting. For what? Shaq wasn't sure. But he knew one thing. This flight wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. The hum of the plane was steady, a rhythmic drone that filled the cabin with an artificial sense of calm. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, a deep void speckled with stars. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Shaq leaned back in his first-class seat, his mind tangled in thoughts he didn't want to entertain. He had worked too hard to bury his past, to create a life that was untouchable, yet here he was, unable to shake the weight pressing down on his chest. The air in the cabin grew colder. The soft hum of conversation in first class had dwindled, and the faint chime of the seatbelt sign flickered overhead. Flight attendants moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting settings, ensuring passengers were comfortable. But not everyone was. Shaq turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward the man in economy, the same man who had unsettled him from the moment he stepped onto the plane. The homeless man sat hunched over in his seat, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, his thin body trembling against the creeping cold. His breath came in uneven puffs, condensation forming in front of his lips. He looked worse than before. Shaq wasn't sure why he kept looking. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, something more uncomfortable, a feeling he wasn't ready to name yet. The other passengers noticed too, though they pretended not to. The businessman across the aisle threw a quick glance, shifting uncomfortably. A woman in a tailored coat pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and turned away, choosing to focus on the in-flight entertainment instead. No one spoke. No one offered help. Shaq exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. It wasn't his problem. The guy had gotten on the plane somehow, which meant he had a ticket. That was all that mattered, right? Then why the hell did it feel like something was clawing at the inside of his chest? Another shiver racked the man's frail frame, his fingers twitching as he tried to pull his threadbare coat tighter around himself. It wasn't enough. The fabric was too thin, too worn. It wouldn't protect him from the biting cold of the high-altitude flight. Shaq cursed under his breath. He wasn't one to get involved in other people's problems, but something about this was bothering him more than it should. Without overthinking, he reached for the luxury coat draped over his seat. It was expensive, hand-stitched Italian wool, tailored to perfection, something most people would notice as a status symbol. He stood up. It was a simple movement, but it felt heavier than it should. A flight attendant passing by paused, her polished smile faltering as she looked at him curiously. "Mr. Shaq, is everything all right?" He ignored her. His steps were measured as he moved toward economy, his presence alone drawing the eyes of a few passengers. The homeless man didn't react at first. He was too lost in his own battle against the cold, too wrapped up in whatever thoughts haunted him. Shaq hesitated for a fraction of a second before draping the coat over the man's shoulders. The reaction was immediate. The man flinched as if he had been struck. His breathing hitched, his fingers instinctively clutching the thick fabric now wrapped around him. His body went still, unnaturally so, like someone who had just been caught in a moment they weren't prepared for. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head and looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time stretched unbearably thin. Shaq expected the man to react with gratitude, maybe even relief, but that wasn't what he saw in his eyes. What he saw was recognition, faint, fleeting, but unmistakable. A strange chill ran down Shaq's spine, and for the first time in a long time, he felt off balance. The man's lips parted slightly, his breath still unsteady, but no words came out. His fingers tightened around the coat as if he were afraid it would be taken away. Shaq cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Keep it," he muttered, his voice lower than usual. The man didn't respond, but he didn't let go of the coat either. His hands were still trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something unspoken. Shaq turned without another word and walked back to his seat, his jaw clenched tight. He had done his part, so why the hell did it feel like this wasn't over? Why did it feel like somehow he had just opened a door he had spent years trying to keep shut? He sank into his seat, exhaling sharply, but the unease refused to leave him. And behind him, wrapped in the warmth of a coat that didn't belong to him, the homeless man lowered his head and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt warm. But it wasn't just the coat. It was something else. Something much, much deeper. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face as he tried to push away the strange unease gnawing at his chest. The coat had been a simple gesture. Nothing more. The man needed warmth, and Shaq had offered it. That was the end of it. Or at least, it should have been. But something about the way the man had looked at him, the flicker of recognition in his tired eyes, the way his fingers trembled against the coat as if the fabric held some unspeakable truth, unsettled him. Shaq turned away, shifting in his seat as he tried to focus on something else. Anything else. That's when he heard it. A voice. Low, hoarse, worn down by time. A whisper. His name. Not the name the world knew him by. Not the name printed in business magazines or flashing across television screens. His real name. The name only his past held. Shaq's entire body tensed. The cabin noise around him faded into nothing. For a split second, he thought he had imagined it. But then slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. The homeless man was looking at him, his pale lips slightly parted, his breath uneven. His eyes, sharp despite their exhaustion, held something ancient and unshakable. Shaq's chest tightened, his stomach turned to lead. Number it wasn't possible. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the thin skin of his throat. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "It's me." The words hit Shaq like a gut punch. The air in his lungs turned cold, sharp, unbearable. A terrible, suffocating silence stretched between them. And then, like a dam breaking, the past came flooding back. A night that never left him. The night Shaq left had been like this. Cold. Quiet. The kind of silence that meant something was coming. Something irreversible. He had stood at the door of their small, crumbling house, his bag slung over his shoulder, his fingers gripping the strap so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His brother had been asleep, curled up under a thin blanket that did nothing against the winter air creeping in through the cracked windows. Shaq had stared at him for what felt like an eternity. He should have woken him up, should have taken him along. But something inside him snapped that night. Something that told him if he stayed, he would never leave. And so, he walked away. And he never turned back. Until now. The weight of recognition. Shaq's fingers curled into the armrests of his seat, his entire body locked in place. The homeless man, his brother, waited, his breathing uneven, his eyes never leaving Shaq's face. "Say something," he murmured, his voice brittle. "Please." Shaq's mind was a storm. His brother. Here, after all these years. The same brother he had abandoned. Shaq's throat felt tight. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. His instinct was to deny it, to shut it down, push it away, act like it wasn't real. But the truth was staring at him, wearing the coat he had just given. Shaq's pulse hammered against his skull. The world around him felt like it was tilting. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he managed to force out a single word. "How?" His brother let out a slow, shaky breath. "I looked for you," he said, his voice raw. "For years. But you disappeared." Shaq felt his heart lurch. His brother kept going, each word hitting like a blow Shaq wasn't ready for. "I lost everything after you left." His voice wasn't accusatory. It was just tired. "Mom. She didn't make it long after. Dad didn't care. And me? I tried. I really did. But the world doesn't have a place for kids like us, Shaq." Shaq's jaw clenched. His fingers dug into the armrest. His brother swallowed hard. "I told myself if I ever found you, I'd ask you why." His voice cracked. "Why did you leave me?" Shaq's chest tightened. He wanted to answer. He wanted to say he was sorry, that he never meant to abandon him, that he thought maybe, just maybe, his brother had found a way out on his own. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there, silent, suffocating under the weight of the past. His brother exhaled shakily, looking away. "Guess it doesn't matter now." But it did. It mattered more than anything. Shaq just didn't know how to fix something that had already been broken. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he ever could. The cabin was eerily quiet, despite the soft hum of the jet engines. Shaq's fingers dug into the armrests, his body stiff, every muscle in his frame coiled tight like a wound spring. His mind was screaming at him to dismiss what he had just heard, to shut it out, to pretend it was a mistake, a coincidence. But deep down, he knew better. The man sitting a few feet away from him was not just a stranger. He was blood. His brother. The thought alone sent a jolt of something sharp and bitter through his veins. "This isn't real," Shaq muttered, shaking his head as he forced out a bitter laugh. This isn't happening." His voice came out strained, laced with something dangerously close to panic. He turned his gaze toward the window, as if searching for a way out, a way to push himself out of this moment and back into a reality where ghosts didn't come knocking. Across the cabin, his brother exhaled shakily, his frail fingers tightening around the coat Shaq had given him. The warmth of it hadn't yet chased away the years of cold he had endured. "It is real." His brother's voice was weak, but there was an edge to it, an unshakable finality. "You can pretend all you want, Shaq. You can sit there and act like you don't know me. But I know you." Shaq's chest tightened. His fingers flexed against the armrest, his jaw set in a hard line. "You're wrong," he muttered, his voice low, almost a warning. "I don't know you." His brother let out a breathless chuckle, but there was no humor in it, only pain. "That's because you left before you had the chance to." The words hit like a hammer, rattling inside Shaq's skull, reverberating in his ribs like an ache he couldn't shake off. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the flight attendants and the rustling of passengers shifting in their seats. Shaq's eyes snapped toward him, his expression darkening. "You think I had a choice?" The words came out harsh, unfiltered. "You think I wanted to leave? That it was easy?" His brother's lips pressed together, his sunken eyes searching Shaq's face, looking for something, anything, he could hold on to. "You never came back." His voice cracked. "Not once." Shaq's breath caught. The plane felt smaller. The air felt heavier. The weight of a decade's worth of silence between them pressed down like an anchor. His brother shifted slightly, wincing as if even speaking was exhausting. "I waited for you," he murmured. "For years, Shaq. I waited. Every day I thought, maybe this is the day he comes back. Maybe this is the day he changes his mind. But you never did." Shaq's fingers curled into fists. "I had nothing," he said, his voice raw. "I left because I had to. Because if I stayed—" He stopped himself before he could say the rest, his throat tightening. "Because if I stayed, I would have been destroyed." His brother scoffed, but there was no real anger behind it, just exhaustion. "And you think I didn't?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Shaq felt like he was drowning. His brother leaned back against the seat, his movements sluggish, worn down by the years of hardship that Shaq had never witnessed. "You want to know what happened after you left?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "After you walked out that door and never looked back." Shaq didn't answer, but his silence was enough. His brother let out a slow, shaky breath. "Mom got sick," he said. "Real sick. She didn't last long. Maybe if she had something to hold on to, she would have fought harder. But you were gone, and Dad—" He swallowed, his eyes dark with memories Shaq hadn't been there to see. "You know what he was like." Shaq closed his eyes for half a second, but the guilt seeped in anyway. "I tried to hold everything together," his brother continued. "But I was just a kid, Shaq. I wasn't you. I wasn't strong enough." His voice wavered. "I ended up on the streets before I even turned 16. Shaq's stomach twisted violently. He knew what the streets could do to a kid. He had barely survived it himself. But his brother, his little brother— "I had nothing," his brother whispered. "Just like you." Shaq forced himself to breathe, forced himself to unclench his fists. But the battle inside him was getting harder to fight. This was too much, too fast, too real. His brother watched him carefully. "Do you know what the worst part was?" Shaq hesitated. "What?" His brother's lips parted, but for a moment no sound came out. Then finally he spoke. "I never even got to be mad at you." Shaq frowned, caught off guard. His brother exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "I couldn't afford to hate you. If I hated you, I had nothing left." He shook his head slightly. "So I told myself you had a good reason, that you'd come back when you were ready, that one day I'd understand." He let out a small, bitter laugh. "But I don't. I don't understand at all." Shaq looked away, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he regretted it? That he had thought about his brother every single day since the moment he left? That he had spent years trying to convince himself that walking away was the only way to survive? No words would fix this. Nothing could erase what had been done. And yet, here they were. His brother stared at him, waiting, maybe hoping. But Shaq wasn't sure if he could give him what he needed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Finally, his brother exhaled and sat back. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Like whatever had been keeping him going had just run out. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, closing his eyes for a brief moment. "I get it now." Shaq frowned. "Get what?" His brother's lips barely moved, but the words cut deeper than anything else. "That I was never worth coming back for." The breath left Shaq's lungs all at once. For the first time in years, something inside him broke, and he had no idea how to put it back together. The cabin lights flickered as the plane lurched violently, jolting passengers from their restless slumber and idle conversations. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the aisles, and somewhere in the distance, A flight attendant's calm but firm voice reassured everyone that the turbulence was nothing more than a routine shake. But for Shaq, it felt like the universe itself was mocking him, forcing him to feel the turbulence not just in the air, but deep inside his chest. His brother swayed in his seat, his body giving way to the exhaustion he had been fighting. His eyelids fluttered, his breathing shallow, the weight of the past pressing down harder than the atmosphere outside the aircraft. The coat Shaq had given him had slipped from his shoulders, revealing the frail frame hidden beneath. His fingers clutched at the armrest, but there was no strength left in them. Then, suddenly, his body gave out. Shaq's reaction was immediate, instinctive. Before his brother could slump to the floor, Shaq was on his feet, catching him just in time. His strong hands gripped his brother's arms, steadying him, pulling him close against his chest. The moment was fleeting, but for Shaq, it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. The warmth of his brother's body against his own, the shallow rise and fall of his weak breaths. It was too real, too close to the memories he had tried so hard to bury. Passengers craned their necks, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Some whispered amongst themselves, others simply watched. The crew hurried down the aisle, concern written all over their faces. "Sir, is everything all right?" one of the flight attendants asked, her voice tinged with alarm. Shaq barely registered her. His focus was solely on the man in his arms, the same man he had abandoned years ago, now collapsing under the weight of the years they had spent apart. He could feel the eyes on him, the silent judgment, the questions forming in the minds of those who had witnessed the scene. But none of it mattered. His brother let out a soft, broken breath, barely above a whisper. I'm fine." Shaq clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't. He was anything but fine. And for the first time in years, Shaq didn't care about pushing the past away. He couldn't. Not when the past was lying limp in his arms, too weak to hold himself up. "Get him water," Shaq ordered gruffly, his voice lower than usual, rough with something he didn't want to name. The flight attendant nodded and rushed toward the galley. Shaq shifted his grip, slowly easing his brother back into his seat. The turbulence outside had begun to settle, but inside, his own storm was just beginning. Shaq ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. His brother sat slumped in the seat, eyes closed, his breathing uneven. Shaq felt the weight of him in a way he hadn't before. He had seen his brother as a stranger, as a ghost from his past, as a reminder of things he wanted to forget. But now, he saw him for what he really was, a man broken by time, by life, by choices neither of them could undo. The water arrived, and Shaq took it without a word. He uncapped the bottle and pressed it into his brother's hand. "Drink," he ordered, softer this time. His brother's fingers trembled as he gripped the bottle, but he took a slow sip, wincing as if even that small action was too much effort. Shaq sat back, running a hand through his hair. He could still feel the eyes of the passengers on him, but he ignored them. Let them wonder. Let them watch. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. He wasn't walking away this time. Shaq sat stiffly in his seat, the weight of his brother's words pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. He could hear the low murmur of passengers in the background, but their voices were distant, muted by the roaring storm inside him. He had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, of moving forward without looking back. Yet here he was, dragged back into a past he had no intention of revisiting. His fists clenched, his pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't sure if it was anger, guilt, or something worse, something that made his chest feel tight and his throat feel raw. "You think I had a choice?" Shaq's voice came out sharper than intended, his gaze burning into his brother. "You think I just walked away because I felt like it?" His brother, weak but defiant, held his gaze. "You did walk away." Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. His jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together. "I did what I had to do," he spat, his voice laced with an anger that had been buried for years. "You don't know what it was like, waking up every day in that house, wondering what kind of hell was waiting on the other side of the door." His brother's expression flickered, but he didn't back down. "You think I don't know?" His voice, though quieter, held an edge that cut through the thick air between them. I lived in that house too, Shaq. I was the one left behind. Shaq's stomach twisted. His breath felt too shallow, his body too hot despite the chilled air in the cabin. I had nothing, he said, voice rough. No one had my back. I had to fight my way out. You. He let out a bitter laugh. You were just a kid. You don't understand. His brother's face darkened. His grip on the coat Shaq had given him tightened. I was just a kid, he repeated, his voice trembling. And you left me there. With him. Shaq froze. The words hit him harder than he expected, knocking the air from his lungs. He had spent years convincing himself that he did what was necessary, that leaving was the only way to survive. He never allowed himself to think about what that meant for his brother. His brother's eyes gleamed with something between exhaustion and frustration. Do you know how long I waited for you? His voice cracked. I searched for you, Shaq. Every single day, I tried to find out where you went, but you disappeared. Shaq swallowed hard. His brother's pain was raw, unfiltered, and it cut deeper than anything their father had ever inflicted. You don't get to stand here and act like the victim, his brother continued, his breath shaky. You left me. I had no one. I had to survive alone. And you became someone else, someone who forgot me. Shaq let out a humorless laugh, but it held no real amusement. You think I forgot? He turned toward his brother fully now, his voice rising. You think I didn't spend years trying to convince myself that I made the right choice? You think I don't wake up some nights wondering if I should have stayed? His brother stared at him, unblinking. Then why didn't you? Shaq faltered. His throat tightened. He had no answer. His brother let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Because it was easier, wasn't it? Easier to move on. Easier to pretend I didn't exist. Shaq clenched his fists. That's not... But he couldn't finish. Because maybe, just maybe, there was some truth in his brother's words. Maybe he had convinced himself that it was easier to let go. Maybe, after all these years, he wasn't as strong as he thought he was. The emotions boiled over between them, thick and unrelenting. The tension in the air was suffocating. Passengers were still watching, some pretending not to listen, others openly staring. But Shaq didn't care anymore. He was too caught up in this moment, this painful, suffocating moment that forced him to confront his demons. His brother exhaled heavily, his eyes wet, his body trembling from exhaustion. I just wanted to find you, he whispered. That's all I ever wanted. Shaq's anger cracked, giving way to something far worse, guilt. The cabin was silent, but inside Shaq's head, everything was deafening. For years he had told himself that his past didn't matter, that he had escaped it, that leaving was the only way to survive. But now, staring at the man he had abandoned, he realized the truth. He had never escaped anything, and he wasn't sure if he ever would. Shaq sat motionless, his mind drowning in the weight of everything that had just unfolded. His brother, his own flesh and blood, sat before him, hunched over, his body frail and giving up. The confrontation had drained them both, but it had done far worse to the man Shaq had left behind. The years of suffering, of struggling to survive alone, had taken their toll. Now, the finality of it hung between them like a blade suspended in the air, ready to fall. His brother coughed, a deep rattling sound that echoed through the cabin. Shaq flinched. For the first time since he had walked away all those years ago, he was afraid. Not for himself, not for the memories clawing at his mind, but for the man before him. His brother's hands trembled as he tried to grip the armrest, but the strength simply wasn't there. His head lolled slightly, his breathing shallow, and a flash of panic surged through Shaq's veins. The past had already taken so much. Was it about to take his brother too? Passengers turned to watch as the cabin crew moved toward them, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. One of the flight attendants leaned in, her voice low and professional, but lined with genuine worry. Sir, is he all right? Shaq looked at his brother, who swayed slightly, his eyelids flickering. No, he wasn't all right. And Shaq couldn't ignore it any longer. I need water, Shaq said, his voice hoarse. And food, anything. The attendant hesitated for only a second before nodding and rushing off. Shaq turned back to his brother, whose breathing had slowed unnervingly. "Stay with me," Shaq muttered, barely recognizing his own voice. His brother let out a weak chuckle, though it came out more like a wheeze. "Didn't think you cared." Shaq's chest tightened. For years he had convinced himself that walking away was the only choice. That if he let go, if he never looked back, he could move forward. But now, seeing his brother like this, seeing the consequences of his decision laid bare, he realized that moving forward had never really happened. He had been running, not living, and now he was out of places to run. The flight attendant returned with a bottle of water and a protein bar. Shaq took them without hesitation, twisting off the cap and pressing the bottle against his brother's chapped lips. He drank in slow, shaky sips before pushing it away. "I looked for you," his brother rasped. "For years." Shaq's hands clenched around the bottle. "I thought, if I found you, things could go back. That maybe, just maybe, I could have my brother back." His voice cracked, and the pain in it was unbearable. "But you didn't want to be found, did you?" Shaq felt his pulse hammering. He had spent years burying the guilt, building walls so high that nothing could break them down. And yet, here he was, broken. He looked at his brother's weak frame, his sunken eyes, his hollowed-out cheeks. The years had not been kind to him, and Shaq had done nothing to stop it. The decision pressed against his ribs, heavy and unrelenting. He had two choices. He could walk away again. Let the past remain buried. Allow the years to stretch between them once more until the distance was too great to ever close. He could convince himself that this was fate, that some things weren't meant to be fixed. Or he could stay. He could face the pain, face the past, face his brother. Shaq swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the bottle aside. The air between them felt electric, a moment stretched to its breaking point. His brother was still looking at him, waiting, hoping, not for grand gestures, not for empty apologies, but for something real. Shaq took a breath, and then another. And then, finally, "I'm sorry." The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to him. But as soon as they were out in the open, the weight on his chest lessened, if only slightly. His brother's eyes flickered, his lips parting slightly in shock. He swallowed, then whispered, "For what?" Shaq let out a slow breath. "For not coming back." His brother stared at him, something unreadable in his gaze. For a moment, Shaq thought he would say something sharp, something that would cut him down the way his absence had cut his brother for years. But instead, his brother simply nodded. And that was enough. Shaq reached for the protein bar, unwrapping it and breaking off a piece. He held it out. His brother hesitated for a second, then took it, his fingers brushing against Shaq's hand. It was such a simple moment, but it carried the weight of a decade's worth of pain, regret, and longing. Forgiveness wasn't easy. It wouldn't happen in an instant. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with unanswered questions, wounds that needed healing, and time that could never be reclaimed. But for the first time in years, Shaq wasn't running. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to walk away this time. The plane descended smoothly through the thick clouds, the city lights below flickering like scattered stars. Shaq stared out of the window, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee, his mind a tangled mess of emotions. He had spent years keeping his past at arm's length, convincing himself that some doors were better left closed. But now, as the runway came into view, he realized something he never thought possible. He didn't want to let go this time. His brother sat beside him, silent, his frail body wrapped in the coat Shaq had given him. His breathing was steadier now, though fatigue still clung to him like a shadow. The weight of their past hadn't vanished, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, they weren't running from each other. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, announcing their final approach. Passengers stirred, stretching stiff limbs and collecting their belongings, but Shaq barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the man beside him, the brother he had once abandoned, the brother he had almost lost again. As the plane touched down, rolling smoothly across the tarmac, Shaq exhaled a slow breath. This was it. The moment of truth. The past had brought them here, but only the future would decide where they went next. The terminal buzzed with activity, a sea of faces moving in every direction. Shaq navigated through the crowd with purpose, his brother at his side, though his steps were slower, weaker. He didn't rush him. Instead, for the first time in years, he matched his pace. "Where are we going?" his brother asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Shaq adjusted the strap of his carry-on, glancing at him. "Home." His brother's steps faltered slightly. He turned his head, studying Shaq with wary eyes, as if trying to decide whether this was real, whether this was something he could trust. Shaq didn't blame him. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a single moment. But it had to start somewhere. Outside, the cold air hit them as they stepped toward the waiting car. Shaq opened the door and gestured for his brother to get in. For a brief second, hesitation flickered in his brother's eyes, but then he exhaled and slid into the seat. Shaq followed, shutting the door behind them. As the car pulled away from the curb, he glanced at his brother, watching as he took in the city, the towering buildings, the bright signs, the life buzzing all around them. For the first time in years, they were in the same place. Together. The apartment was quiet, dimly lit by the warm glow of the city skyline outside. Shaq set his keys down on the counter and turned to face his brother, who stood near the doorway, still clutching the coat around him like a shield. "You hungry?" Shaq asked, breaking the silence. His brother hesitated, then nodded. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Shaq moved to the kitchen, rummaging through cabinets, pulling out whatever he could find. It wasn't much, a couple of leftovers, some bread, but it was enough for now. He set a plate down on the table and motioned for his brother to sit. His brother hesitated again before lowering himself into the chair. He picked up the fork with slow, deliberate movements, as if he wasn't sure this was real. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe neither of them were. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the occasional clink of silverware. But for the first time in years, it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the silence of two people avoiding a conversation, avoiding the truth. It was the silence of something beginning. Later that night, Shaq sat on the balcony, staring at the city below. His brother joined him, leaning against the railing, his body still weak, but his presence stronger than it had been before. "You didn't have to do this," his brother said after a long pause. Shaq sighed. "Yeah, I did." His brother looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Why?" Shaq took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I made a mistake." He turned to face him fully. "Because I walked away once, and I can't do it again." His brother studied him, searching for cracks, for dishonesty. But there was none. After a long moment, he nodded. It was small, barely noticeable. But to Shaq, it meant everything. They weren't fixed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But they were here. And that was more than enough. As the city pulsed below them, two estranged brothers sat side by side, no longer bound by the ghosts of their past, but by the possibility of something new. A new journey. Together. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Shaq made his choice, but what about you? Would you walk away or fight for redemption? Let's keep the conversation going. Comment your thoughts, share this story, and tag a friend who needs to read it. Follow us for more gripping, emotional stories. The past shapes us, but the future is ours to write. Together.